Welcome to this series on taking up our responsibility for racial justice. It's wonderful to be together with so many folks. Let's begin by praying together. Good and gracious God, you invite us to recognize and reverence your divine image and likeness in our neighbor, who is every person. Enable us to see the reality of racism in our history, our present, our systems, and ourselves, and free us to challenge it and do the long and long overdue work to uproot it from our society, giving us the courage to listen, to be uncomfortable, to be surprised, and to find new ways forward in the light of your love. We ask this as all things in your name, O Jesus. Amen. And so, friends, like all of you, I have been doing all of this reading and more and listening to podcasts and seeing things online. And as I've been going through that, I'm asking, what's different now? Well, I keep coming to the same thing as a don't think of myself as racist, pretty nice person, practicing Christian, middle-class, progressive white lady of a certain age. And it's that everything I read, from the books to the articles to the people of color I follow online, boils down to my needing to be willing to be uncomfortable when confronting racism, my own racism, to say things wrong and be corrected without losing my mind, without getting defensive. I need to listen to what people of color are saying and have been saying. And that is the work of dismantling racism, that it has to start within me. I've got inner work to do. That's not to deny that there is outer work, action to be taken in the world here. But it's not going to work without my facing my own inner work. And I suspect you have inner work to do too. Not because I suspect there's something wrong with you, but because we are part of the same society. The system that created and perpetuates a racism and keeps us blind to white privilege. This is white people's work to do. And we're gathering here not for an intellectual exercise or to look at the outside world, but to start here examining what's our interior world and what does that mean in terms of the systemic racism that we're all part of. I'm uncomfortable already. How about you? And I don't say that just in jest. I'm leading this session today, but I'm not a leader in taking responsibility for racial justice. I'm just another white person who is uncomfortably recognizing how I've got work to do and wants to do the work. That's why we're here together today and for 3 more Wednesdays to start, or really continue, the journey of doing the inner work and the work in the world, to stop being consciously and unconsciously racist and stop harming people of color. There will be more here at St. Mark's for sure, but no matter what we do here, there's going to be more for each of us to do in our own lives and as members of society. It's an ongoing journey and part of our continually growing into our call as followers of Jesus Christ in a broken world that is also full of grace. We've all got our own stories and experiences of how racism has been part of our lives, or how we first notice it, or how we've experienced it or perpetuated it, whether we knew it or not. I think back to my own childhood, and the school I went to a Catholic elementary school and a Catholic high school back in New York State. And there was only one black person in my entire class the whole time I went to school, from kindergarten right up through 12th grade. One person. And he was my friend, Tom, and he was part of the circle of friends that we ran around with and did things with back in those days. But I think about now how difficult it must have been to be the only person of color in the entire group. We were friends, But some of our friends would tell jokes, say funny things, that had racial content. And Tom would chuckle, and we would chuckle, and people like me would chuckle in that kind of scandalized way. That's not funny. Now, don't tell jokes like that. But we'd still laugh. And this is the world he had to live in. And this is the world that I was part of. A world that said, yeah, something feels funny about that, but we're all friends here and we're just joking. And we're all the same here. And we're not all the same here because we were all white. And Tom was the only black person in our whole group. And he had to hear this kind of stuff. And he didn't feel the safety or have the words at that time to articulate that that's not okay. And neither did I. And to this day, I look back on those days and think, what a mess that was. How inappropriate that was. But I didn't think about that all along. And I think lots of us have stories, some closer to home, some bigger things, some smaller things. They're part of our experience of recognizing that the school I went to had all white people in it. And the street I lived on had all white people in it. And no one in my inner circle, in my family even, was overtly racist. We wouldn't have cared if someone moved in next door, but I bet someone on the street would have, and I never gave it a thought that there weren't people of color on my street. I grew up in a segregated society. And my one friend, who was a person of color, had to live with that stuff. What's your story? You know that it's in there somewhere. It's uncomfortable to say it out loud, and it's important to say it out loud and to look inside and know what we're carrying. So here we are together. We're working together. On week 1, we've read and listened to, and now we're examining what is race, what is racism, and what is white privilege. In our series, we're looking at themes of how race is a social construct. Race is not something that's in our DNA. Race is something that society has looked at, and the definition of what race is has changed because it's something written down on paper. So race is a social construct. And racism is bias reinforced by power. Racism isn't just noticing or saying something about someone looks different than I am. Racism is having biases that the power gives voice to and system to. That's what racism is. That's why it's not reverse racism. Racism is held by the group in power. And that brings us to white privilege. White privilege is a fundamental underpinning of our culture. We need to just own it. It's not our fault today that this is what's inherited, but if we're not looking at it and recognizing it, it's in there. White privilege doesn't mean your life isn't hard as a white person. You could have had the hardest life ever. It just means that the color of your skin isn't one of the things that makes it harder. And let's not pretend that the color of our skin, if we were people of color, wouldn't be the main factor making it harder. Systemic racism. It is harder if your skin isn't white. Systemic racism impacts people of color in all parts of life: housing, education, health, policing, criminal justice system, jobs. We'll be talking about all of these things in our breakout groups. We're coming together, as your syllabus notes, to consider our work as a church and as individuals to address racism, to address white privilege, and ways that we can respond appropriately. And although it can be painful for white people, like me, to confront white privilege and to be uncomfortable about some of the ways we've experienced it in our own lives and perpetuated it in our own lives, even without meaning to, even without malice, we must discuss it openly together and do our own inner work with it. We don't want to get off on an intellectual tangent in this series today. We're here for the nitty-gritty inner work. And if we think it hurts or that the work is hard, Let's recognize that it is painful for our community's people of color to live in the racist system every single day, not just in sharing an uncomfortable story in a series, and uncomfortable for the people of color in our community to see how much work we still have to do here, even though we really do love each other. But we do commit to the work, held up by our faith, and recognizing it is a lifelong commitment. So before we start, let me take a few minutes to talk about the way we are entering into these conversations. We are recognizing that some things are true right at the outset. Racism is real, and people of color are harmed by it. White privilege is real, and white people benefit from it, even if we're unaware of it. And we're also harmed by it and diminished by it, even if we're unaware of it. Racism goes beyond individual intentions to systemic issues. One's not being aware of racism doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We are going to have these conversations bravely and be generous with each other as we step into this uncomfortable territory. When we go into our breakout groups and we're talking together, assume that we each are well-meant. Be aware that opinion is not the same thing as informed knowledge. Recognize that there's a difference between agreement and understanding. Sometimes I don't agree really means I don't understand. Respect that the experience and work of the people of color among us is different from that of white people. Do not ask people of color in your group to speak for all people of color or to say what's okay or not okay for us to say as white people. Each group has a facilitator to help us share the time together well. But we each need to pay attention to good practices for small group discussions. Listen deeply and try on new ideas. No fixing. Each person must discover their own truths. When you speak, respect the time so everyone has a chance to share. Speak your truth. Be willing to be uncomfortable, to say something difficult. Allow for the difference between intention and impact. Acknowledge uncomfortable responses with ouch or whoops, and then explain. The intention may not have been to hurt, but if you've experienced as hurt, just putting a pin in it with ouch or whoops gives us a chance to talk about it, and for the person who has said it to recognize that the impact may have hurt, even if the intention didn't, and for us to understand each other better. Respect silence after someone has spoken, to fully reflect and listen. And absolutely maintain confidentiality. What is spoken in the group stays in the group. Don't bring up another person's story or comments outside of the group. And do not share other stories without their permission. A story is a very personal thing. And if you find it difficult, and if you need to step away for a minute to collect yourself, do. But be willing to come back. Now, Jennifer is going to share a longer document with these norms with you, and she'll send it out with your materials for next week. But now, let's get sharing. Our format tonight is that we'll have 2 25-minute sessions of small group discussion with 10 minutes or so after each one to collect ourselves and our thoughts in the larger group. These are the questions for tonight's session. It's not important to get to all of them, but rather to have a real and deep discussion together. I will put these onto the chat so that you'll be able to see them. What did you learn about race growing up? That's the first question we'll be pulling apart here in our breakout sessions. What did you learn about race growing up? What was taught explicitly and what was absorbed implicitly? What messages did you internalize? Another thing we'll discuss in our small groups is identifying some ways that you are privileged. We're all privileged in some ways. Think about them. What about what you've heard tonight about race and privilege is new for you? And what are your hopes for this work? These questions your facilitator will have on hand also, so that we'll be able to talk about them when we go into our breakout groups. Now note that this plenary session is recorded, but our small group discussions around these questions are confidential and they are not recorded. Now we'll just take a minute of silence to consider the questions and gather your thoughts, and then Jennifer will move us into our small groups. What did you learn about race growing up?